Just kidding. Sorry about the dramas with the first videos. This is a special Redux version where the sound works. It's Dr. Lloyd-Moffett, and we are here to introduce this mini module on spiritual psychosis. Now, I have to admit, when I first started teaching this class, this topic was largely something I just added on to the end because I liked the idea of sadhu, Sufis, monks, and madmen. And I thought there'd be a lot of academic work on it. And I thought it'd be fascinating. I still find it fascinating, but there's actually been very little academic work. And so this section has really evolved over the years, and it really has become one of my own personal areas of research. Now, we have to be clear about what we're talking about in this section, because there are some people who hold that all religion is an example of psychosis. I mean, anyone who believes in, unseen gods, angels flying around, demons going around, clearly such a belief is insane. And someone like Stephen Freud will say it's a sign of neurosis if you just look at all the actions that religious people do. And so there is a whole area of study about whether belief in any sort of religious positions is sane or not, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about sort of any religious perspective being insane. Also, I should be clear that we're not talking about feigning spiritual insanity. That is, acting insane. We talked about that a lot during the asceticism section on courting social dishonor. If you recall, sometimes a ascetic strategy would be to feign insanity in order to heap social hate upon you and detach you from the opinions of others. Now, that's not what we're talking about here. Though I might point out that it's not always clear to me how later analysts can determine when someone was feigning it and when they were actually experiencing psychosis. And so maybe there is more overlap there than we think, and maybe it's just not a, black or white issue. Maybe this is an issue of lots of gray areas, and if psychosis is some sort of spectrum, maybe, it's hard to say they're feigning it or not. But anyhow, we are not talking about courting social dishonor by feigning insanity. And also, we're not talking about sort of temporary bouts of insanity. If someone takes a lot of psychedelics, for example, they'll see things that make them seem insane, but we can identify the trigger. We can show that it's temporary. So that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about in this mini module is people who have genuine psychosis, that is, genuine mental illness, and yet seem to have authentic and real spiritual experiences. Now, there's not even a term for this, maybe spiritual insanity, holy madness, but people who have genuine psychosis and yet are determined to be holy. How do we know? And to remind you, the reason why this has become so interesting to me is my nephew, around the age of 11, started experiencing psychosis. Now, this is a very early age to experience psychosis, and much of that psychosis manifested itself in seeing visions and voices that were religious in nature. Now, this was slightly a surprise because my sister and brother-in-law aren't particularly religious, but for many times my nephew would see demons or angels and say, "Hey, Uncle Steve, do you see them up there? Do you see that?" Sometimes they were positive spiritual forces, but sometimes they were negative too. Especially, he went through a period where he thought Disney was satanic. Um, and of course, for much of that time of the past 5 or 6 years, my sister has called upon me to talk to my nephew because my nephew says, "Oh, the religious studies professor, he'll understand." And so I've spent a lot of time trying to share with Ian that those things are probably in his mind, and they probably are. But as a religious studies professor, I began to think through, well, how do I know that they are? In other words, how do I know that what he is experiencing in a vision of voice is something categorically different from, say, Hildegard of Bingen, who we saw earlier? In other words, by what metric can I say for sure that Ian's spiritual visions and voices by psychosis is something that is due to mental illness and not an authentic religious experience? And so those are the sorts of questions that I'm exploring in my own work, and some of this will come up especially in the second lesson. So what we are looking at are people who are generally perceived to be experiencing psychosis or mental illness and have spiritual experiences. And how do we sort through those very difficult characteristics together? That's what this mini module is about.